I found online Mad Hatter's disease. What is that? People making felt hats were using mercury as part of the process. They were known as Mad Hatters, right? Alice in Wonderland story, I was a Mad Hatter, even unexplainable anger, anxiety, all of it. To be healthy today, it's not as simple as just changing the diet. I think that 20 years ago it was. Most people changed their diet, they lost weight, they felt better, all the symptoms went away. Today, we're not dealing with that. Cell membranes are the key to feeling good. There's a saying, and I didn't come up with it, life and death begins on the membrane. Your hormone health, how much energy you have, the lack of brain fog, how good your brain works, your digestion begins on the membranes. If we don't restore the cell energy, if you don't get rid of the toxins that are just crushing cell energy, you can sit in the front of red light all you want, sit in the sun outside all you want, you go, why doesn't it work for me? Because you have so much inflammation driven by toxins and bad fats, it will not work for you until you deal with that. That's the message that I teach.
Right now in the West, we have a major explosion of chronic disease, obesity. A lot of people are sick, and a big piece of this is the food we're consuming. So given that, what are the top foods you're seeing people continue to consume that are major drivers in this?
Yeah, let me back up just 1 second and say it this way. It's more about the toxins that are in the foods. For example, a lot of people are focused on the macro things, meaning proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, right? I mean, that's where we think the big problem is. Just getting back from Italy and France, I can assure you, well, I looked it up. Italians, who actually in 2023 took the healthiest country in the world, behind Singapore, they eat 20% more carbs than we do. And that's refined carbohydrates. Now, again, I think there's better carb choices, not my point. But the point is that what do their carbs not carry with it? Well, it doesn't carry with it the loads of chemicals, like glyphosate is just one example that's outlawed there, that are causing leaky gut, autoimmune, leaky brain. Their products typically aren't housing endocrine disruptors. Those are hormone disruptors that are causing us to be fat. Matter of fact, we've now nicknamed these chemicals obesogens and diabetogens, meaning they cause us to be fat and have diabetes. So I think it's the foods that contain the most of these types of chemicals that we have to avoid. And we can stop debating about, the macros, right? Because fats, carbohydrates, and proteins all have their role and are good. And matter of fact, I teach something called diet variation, where we should be low carb, sometimes high carb, sometimes, and it actually, the change is the magic. But let's look at some of the grains and the reason why we have so much explosion of autoimmune. Yeah, grains are a problem. Gluten's a problem because it is loaded with this chemical glyphosate, which opens up our gut barrier and is driving these allergies that we're seeing. And yes, they make us fat. But again, I could pick on some other foods as well.
All right, just so I have that straight. So we're talking about glyphosate. You mentioned obesogens. Is that something separate? Let's get into some of the nuance of what these different chemicals are that we're talking about here.
Yeah, glyphosate isn't labeled as an obesogen like plastics, forever chemicals. You're hearing a lot about nano particles, microplastics. That was 2 weeks ago, right? It hit the headlines everywhere. 1 liter of bottled water contains 240,000 particles of plastic. The scientists in the studies, literally themselves seeing it, said, I will never drink bottled water again, right? And of course, they led to the fact that these contain phthalates, which are obesogens, hormone disruptors, right? Glyphosate indirectly is causing a lot of these problems. Stephanie Seneff, she is one of the senior scientists at MIT. 2012 study, she was the first to show that it is causing, a drive in diabetes and endocrine problems because it opens up our blood-brain barrier, it opens up our gut, and indirectly is driving these pandemics as we see them. But and autism and Alzheimer's. I mean, she made a list of different conditions. So glyphosate indirectly is also setting us up for these other chemicals that our protective barriers would actually, protect us somewhat from some of these other chemicals like plastic particles, et cetera. So it's making things worse. Even the heavy metals that we're exposed to in big numbers these days, the glyphosate makes worse, according to her study, allowing aluminum and mercury to cross deeper into the brain, which leads to problems with hormones. So yeah, there's a lot here.
All right. Well, where do we begin? Because it's more than the food. You brought it into the water already, and we're going to go into the environment in a general sense as well throughout our discussion here. But sticking to food for now, we know glyphosate, a big part of the problem here. Is going organic enough? Or at least how do we begin?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think going organic is a solution, part of the solution. I think that for some people hearing that, that's devastating news in itself. Why? Just because they can't even afford organic. I appreciate that. And then my next thing is, okay, at least eat from the clean 15. Google it, right? I mean, it's like here, and stay away from the dirty dozen. Google it. There's a list of foods. If you're going to eat from the dirty dozen, your kids love this particular fruit or vegetable, then buy that one organic, right? If you can't afford it, eat from the clean 15. So, it really, that everyone I think can do. I think there's a solution there for everybody. But yes, we have to limit what comes in. And, doing that at least limits the amount of this chemical glyphosate that's coming in, to our bodies, that sets us up for a greater exposure from other chemicals that we can't control, right? I mean, come on, forever chemicals. I mean, again, very popular right now, that are in just about everything that we're using and bringing into our home, from dental floss to toilet paper, to cosmetics. I mean, anything water resistant, water repellent. I mean, flame retardants. How do we avoid this, right? Well, glyphosate makes it all worse, right? So, it is a super toxin in a sense, that I call it. But I think that we still have to be prudent and avoid as much of these plastic, right? I mean, come on. I mean, it's around us. It surrounds us. I get plastic exposures every day. So do you, and we're conscious. So, what do? I think we have to really be smart about the products we're buying, and limit the glyphosate.
Have you looked at any research showing that when we do buy organic, how much glyphosate is on there? Because I'm assuming, and what I've heard is there is some cross-contamination even within the organic foods, which leads me to my next question. What would you do to clean off your produce, even if you're buying organic, to try and get as much of this stuff off as possible before you eat it?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you raise a good point. It's, what do they estimate? It's in 60% of rainfall now, right? Glyphosate. So that means that you're picking up at least some in organic fruits and vegetables. Definitely far less. Yes, and you can spray some of it off, right? Especially when it comes from rainfall. You can, use something as simple as a little bit of hydrogen peroxide or vinegar, and they have vegetable washes today with certain enzymes that are good. You can buy them in almost every grocery store. So yeah, I would recommend doing that. I think it's smart to do that. But again, I think avoiding some of the the big exposures. I mean, that's where the clean 15 came from, right? Is like, at least let's get rid of these big exposures. Our bodies, our cells, are set up to get rid of a certain amount of toxins. I think the mistake that we make is saying we can't do anything about it, so forget about it. I think that's a big mistake. But I think our cells I know our cells have the ability to get rid of a certain level. So let's minimize the exposure. Let's keep our cellular detox pathways running to protect us. I mean, because you look at people who are being affected and they have the symptoms from brain fog, anxiety, gut problems. They've went over the threshold, but others are still coping. Why? Because their cellular detox pathways, which we'll get to that, right? How do we improve that? But, are working better. But everybody genetically has what I call a different size bucket, meaning some of us have a bigger bucket. We can actually tolerate more to one day it overflows, right? And that's when the symptoms start. Some of us have smaller buckets that overflow faster. But the fact is we have to minimize what we're putting into the bucket, and then we have to actually keep our buckets empty.
Well, let's move into that now. So we know we want to minimize. We know genetics are going to determine how big our bucket is. What do we do to upregulate detox or help empty that bucket out? Because even now we know buying organic, you're still going to get exposed to a lot of this stuff. And we're only talking about food and water so far. We're going to get into other environmental pieces. And in the modern world, we're being bombarded from every angle throughout the day. Like you said, even people like us that are conscious and making better choices. So let's move into things we can do to bail out that bucket as it's naturally going to fill up for all of us.
No, that's great. This is a good conversation. I do want to make that, I did a social media video and I showed pictures of people in New York City and from 1931. And it was different pictures. What don't you see?
Fat people?
You didn't see fat people, man. And so the question then, and this is why, I think there's a few things to look at. But the biggest thing happened after World War II. It's called the chemical revolution. And we've now been exposed to chemicals that at levels that humans, our cells are just being overwhelmed with. Back then, they weren't exposed to these chemicals, arguably, right? They had, different, the diets that we are able to eat today are better and easier. However, they also didn't have exposure to these fake oils, canola oil, vegetable oil, which again drives cellular inflammation. And, that's a big problem, right? They were eating lard and butter, which we have avoided as being bad in the modern day era. So if we just take those two things, that is why you don't see fat people. And I made the point too, getting back from France and Italy, you can tell the tourists just from the people that live there. The people that live there are not, they're not fat as a whole, right? I mean, there's exceptions, of course, but as a whole, you see an entirely different population of people. Why? It really is. Most of the chemicals that are driving this problem are banned there. And it's amazing. I mean, Gatorade's banned. I mean, if a company wants to sell certain products, certain cereal companies, they can't sell the same product in Europe because of certain chemicals that are banned there. So, we have to understand that, the level of this problem. Okay. So, what can we do about it? Because I made the argument, if we can keep our cells functioning, we have a defense. God designed us that way. So I developed what I called my 5 R's as a roadmap to what we need to do. By the way, I developed this teaching doctors for 20 years. And I remember some lectures I was giving and leaving there. I was on an airplane and I could tell it didn't hit home. I was talking to a group of doctors, but yet I could see the look. I've lectured enough to know when you hit it and when you don't. I was very frustrated with myself, but then I literally, true story, I prayed, and I'm telling you, it was like answers started coming. Picked up my notebook and I started taking notes. The 5 R's was born. What is it? Okay, R number 1, if we're going to use this bucket theory, is we do have to slow down the input. We already discussed that, right? And we have to do the best we can as individuals in a family. So that is remove the source. R number 1, you have to remove the sources to the best of your ability. And we can talk about these super sources that I think is part of answering this question. We'll get there. So we can circle back to that. R number 2 is regenerating the cell membranes. What does that mean to our average listener? Oh my God. Okay, remember, this started with teaching doctors. Cell membranes are the key to feeling good. There's a saying, and I didn't come up with it. Life and death begins on the membranes. Okay, let me rephrase it. Your hormone health, how much energy you have, the lack of brain fog, how good your brain works, your digestion begins on the membranes. Bruce Lipton, he wrote the book Biology of Belief. He talks about the membranes and how life, innate intelligence that runs everything in your body, it's in the membranes. Okay, so it's not my scientific discovery that the membrane is key to all health, including hormone health, which is absolutely disaster in this country, and people are trying to fix it by taking more hormones. If we're only that simple, it's not. It's the membrane. That's where the hormone receptors are. Okay, so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. What you can do if you're listening to this to help your membrane, avoid vegetable and canola oils like the plague, you and your family. It's not as simple as going to Whole Foods, because if you go to Whole Foods, they have canola oil in all of their products when you go to eat at their deli, or whatever it's called. So it's not that simple. You have to be clever enough to pick it up and just say, okay, I'm not eating canola oil, I'm not eating vegetable oil, soybean oil, most seed oils, not all, most seed oils are overly processed and are bad. So, but I can make some arguments, but let's not get into that, because we take people down the wrong trail. If you avoid seed oils, stick to olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil. Those are very stable oils. You can find snacks for your kids in health food stores with all those better oils. Avoid the vegetable and the canola oils, soybean oils, seed oils in general. You're going to do really well. Okay, so that is where you start this argument of how we fix our membranes. Now, let's talk about where there's a little more confusion. Everyone talks about the benefits of fish oil. I'm telling you, the answer to the membranes are not fish oil. Omega-6 is the answer. It's the king of the membranes. It's not my opinion. It's scientific. I don't have a problem with omega-3s, but omega-6 has a bad rap, but yet is the most important fat in the cell membranes, because that's what vegetable canola oils are. That's what makes them so devastating for our health, is because they integrate into our membranes and drive inflammation, which blunts our hormone receptors. So we need healthy omega-6, grass-fed meats, healthy omega-6, right? And you can also get it into some, better products that have healthier omega-6s. But if you're eating whole foods, you're getting healthy omega-6. So it really is an argument of getting those good fats. Should I go on to R3, or should I stop?
Let's stop here for a bit. You brought up fish oil. Let's talk about why that is something you recommend against.
Yeah.
Let's get into the nuance there.
I'm in a very small group, admittedly, that I hate fish oil. No, but let me stop right there and back up. I love fish oil in fish. I love vegetable oil in vegetables. Okay. So, but I don't like it when it's removed, because yes, it is extremely fragile. Fish oil is not discussed like that, because people want to make an argument that their fish oil is not rancid. But the problem is, when we look at studies, the Cochrane collaboration study, Google it, folks. I mean, it's not my opinion. Even more modern studies with Cochrane, what they do with Cochrane is they pull the studies and they have an evaluation of what they think is a good study. They throw out the bad ones, they keep the good ones, so they can actually come to a conclusion. Very, very accurate. Okay, so we're not just pinpointing one study, and we're not just pinpointing one study that's bad. We're literally looking at the best studies and then coming up with a conclusion. That's what Cochrane does, the collaboration. So when they did this on fish oil, it comes out bad every time. It's like for heart disease, for immune conditions, cancers, it comes out bad. Well, because even when you take a fish oil in, it starts to go rancid. Your body has to use its own protective mechanisms, antioxidants, to actually battle against it. So not a fan of fish oil. There's more and more people coming to this realization, because it's really not supported by the literature. Once Big Pharma got into the fish oil industry, it became very, different. Then all these studies came out that, that they funded to back fish oil, but it's simply not the case. And again, I challenge you to dig deeper on your own, because I know you're going to get all these fish oil lovers out there that, swear by it, and they're going to send you certain studies. But if you dig into those studies, then you will come up with a different conclusion. Look, another MIT grad here, he wrote the book, The PEO Solution. I'm looking over there because I recently pulled it up in an interview. But here, no, that's not it. I thought I had it right here. Darn, they took it off my desk. But anyway, PEO Solution. I thought I saw it there. it's a really good resource of somebody who put all the studies together. Brian Peskin is the author.
If you're enjoying this episode, take a second and let me know by clicking like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the show. All right, so to make sure I have this clear then, omega-3s, it sounds like in general they're being overblown. You're against taking fish oil supplements, but we can get our omega-3s through whole foods like fish. Given all that, do you have a certain threshold you like to reach through dietary means, say on a weekly basis, having salmon, say once or twice a week, to make sure you're getting those omega-3s in? Or do you just find that grass-fed, grass-finished beef has enough? How do you look at those?
I'm a fan of omega-3 and omega-6. Matter of fact, they're called what we call the parent oils, meaning that, and they're essential. They're essential for life, right? But what's not essential is DHA. DHA is not an essential fat in the human body. So we don't need fish oil, of course. I mean, think about the tribes, people that they had no access to fish, and yet they lived healthy. Our bodies will create DHA from the parent fats, the LAN, the ALA, omega-3, omega-6. It will create that. Now, some will argue, some people can have the enzyme deficiency that they won't produce enough. Yeah, I don't know about that, but there is some options that you can do. There's a couple products. I'm looking over here because I might have one, but that has ahi flour in it. I don't have it, but ahi flour actually helps that process. It helps you create DHEA when you need it, so you can't overdose. The problem is when you look at the doses, it's part of your question, that people are taking 3,000 milligrams of fish oil. I mean, my gosh, it's a pharmacological overdose, meaning if you look at what the human body needs, our brain probably arguably needs the most. It's very little. You're talking about 7 milligrams. Your body creates it very easy. So it's really not needed. When we look at people are taking because they're sold to get, fish oil is good for your skin and, omega-3, it's actually omega-6 that's the most dominant in skin. So again, making fish or making vegetable oils, canola oils, that the reason it's so bad is because it's so important in so many cell membranes. The DHEA is just not essential. And again, I'm not saying it's not good and important, but your body will make it. So you don't need a lot. If you to fully answer your question, the omega-3 and omega-6, if you're eating real food, you're going to get it. If you're eating grass-fed meat, you're going to get it. If you're eating, it's in vegetables, seeds, healthy, eating whole foods, right? You're going to get it. The problem that you will say is people aren't. And okay, I agree with that. You're right. And I think that they'll benefit from a product. There's a few products on the market that have a really good, stable omega-3, omega-6 balance without fish oil. I'm not here to sell a product, but the guy I mentioned, he built a product out, Brian Peskin. His product called, it's Pure Omegas is the company, I believe. But
do you know what the source of the omegas is in that product?
Yeah, they make sure that they test them completely and thoroughly. But they'll use some seeds to get it. But again, seeds oil done correctly can be good. A flax seed done correctly can be good. Even a sesame seed done correctly, cold pressed, can is stable enough to be okay. But they can use hemp as another good seed that easily can be very stable and has a very nice balanced 4-to-1 ratio of omega-3, omega-6, or omega-6 to omega-3, 4-to-1. And by the way, when we talk about that ratio in nature, the ratio is 1-to-1 to 1-to-5, 6 even, right? Where we see a balance of omega-6 being the dominant. So like in that product, there's more omega-6 than omega-3. Grass-fed meat could be 1-to-1 to 1-to-6 even in grass-fed meats.
Somebody like you that's eating a quality, well-balanced diet, do you take a product like this to get additional omegas? Or is it
Yeah.
something you take periodically?
I take them randomly, right? I take them randomly. I built a product out called Membrane R2. That's where we got our conversation of 5 hours. So I built a product out for that specifically for my detox program. But there's some other products out there that are good too.
All right. Before we move to the next R, for somebody that's been eating a standard type diet or even a healthier diet, but again, maybe is going to Whole Foods and eating at the hot bar and has been taking in some of these bad oils, integrating those into the fat of their body, other than avoidance from this point forward, what can they do to facilitate getting those out quicker, or can they?
That's where I think taking a good product actually helps, right? That's why I developed that Membrane R2 product because eventually they replace it. When you take in, I want to draw this. When you take in one of these fats, it's worse to take in vegetable and canola oil than it is to eat sugar. If you make an exception periodically and have some sugar desserts, things like, your body burns it up. And if you do it all the time, yes, it can be bad. But the problem is that these fats, these bad fats, make their way into our cell membrane. Here, they last for not hours, like burned up sugar, not days, but months, arguably 4 months. Now they're saying, some people are saying even longer. The reason is because they make up this membrane, right? And this lipid bilayer, 2 layers of fat, is where our hormone receptors are. Okay. And the reason I'd say that is because so many people are having thyroid problems, estrogen, testosterone, right? I mean, all these hormones that we're very familiar with, right? Progesterone, insulin. Okay. So now let me come back into frame. These hormones, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, insulin, thyroid hormone, T3, right? So we look at blood levels. So if I would just draw an artery as representing, my thing ran out, I'm going to use this. If we look at, I'm just going to draw an artery representing blood levels. If we look at our blood levels of, say, T3 or insulin, okay, and let's say that I have symptoms of a thyroid, like I had at one point. My hair was thinning. This was back in 1999 when I got sick. I was getting skinny fat, losing muscle, getting fat, never happened. No energy, brain fog, constipation. I mean, all these symptoms, right? Went and got my blood test done, but my thyroid, my TSH was normal. All my thyroid hormone was normal. Doc said, but I knew my thyroid wasn't functioning. We call that subclinical hypothyroid. And that's where most people start for 10 years, 20 years. And then one day the blood levels go down. And then we go, oh, okay, we'll put you on a hormone. And then we make the blood levels normal again. But here's the problem. What no one's paying attention to is the real problem. And that's the inflammation being driven by these bad oils and toxins that blunt these hormone receptors. Now, it doesn't matter what your blood levels are, made normal by your hormones, or maybe they're still normal. If the hormone can't get its message in the cell, and how does it do that? It has to attach to a receptor, no different than your cell phone, has to connect to a receptor tower. If you don't have a tower near you, that $1,000 cell phone is useless to you. Okay, so these receptors act as those antennas, and when our hormones attach to those, it gets itself or a message in the cell, all is well. Thyroid hormone, we burn fat normally in our mitochondria, right? We have normal energy. We don't have brain fog. Oh, wonderful. When it happens with insulin, we bring glucose in the cell, we burn it up. We don't get diagnosed with diabetes or pre-diabetes. We matter of fact, we don't store fat because insulin's a fat storing hormone. All is well, as long as we're not resistant to that hormone. This is called insulin resistance, but it's hormone resistance is the epidemic, right? Okay, so back to the question. These fats, these omega-6 fats are the big issue in this membrane. When we get good omega-6, then it will eventually start to replace these bad omega-6, which in this cell membrane for months and months, driving this inflammation, causing all these symptoms that so many people have. So I think that that's why taking a product that has a good balance, and again, I think his product is pure maintenance or pure omega is his product. But if we take some of these good fats, get rid of the bad fats, we can get those membranes to regenerate themselves.
And to summarize what you just drew out there, basically, a lot of people aren't even going to get to step one, which would be testing the blood for these different molecules. Even if we do go that far and see our thyroid level or our insulin level, you're taking this a step further and saying that because the cell membranes are being influenced by these bad oils, your blood levels can look good, but you're not actually going to have the impact on the cell.
Exactly.
So given all that, is there a test that we can do to see how our cell membranes are? Or is it just a waiting game? You mentioned months there, and using maybe a product like you mentioned to clean that up quicker. Is there anything objective we can do to see where our cell membranes are at this point?
The cheapest, most inexpensive way is called a meta-oxy test. And what it measures is something called mellandaldehyde. And what that is when a membrane is inflamed and oxidized, it puts off this mellandaldehyde, and it's measurable in urine. They use this in studies for autoimmune. They use it to, see when levels get to a certain point. But it is a very inexpensive way, accurate way to assess cellular inflammation. If you asked your doctor for an inflammation test, they would run something called a CRP, C-reactive protein, but it's more broad systemic inflammation and really doesn't focus on this lipid peroxidation, lipid meaning that fat layer around the membrane. Lipid peroxidation gives off this mellandaldehyde. We're able to measure that. There is a test that got popular. Johns Hopkins did it, where they're looking at the fatty acid ratios, omega-3, omega-6 in a balance, and they can tell, by this, your balance and how healthy your cell membranes are. It's a way more expensive test, however, somewhere in the range of $500-$600. But the other thing is phase angle is some tests that people utilize to look at cell membrane. People aren't going to be able to typically get that test done. But, that's where you start. I've utilized that cell membrane inflammation mellandaldehyde test for many years as a starting point for people.
Other than taking these oils in orally through the diet, any other influences acting directly on that cell membrane in a negative way that are having a similar effect?
Yeah. So when we look at, there's three big driving factors of cellular inflammation. And again, when I say cellular inflammation, let your mind translate that into hormone disruption, lack of energy, inability to burn fat, right? So I don't want to just throw out terms that become like meaningless. But if we put it to the amount of symptoms that people are experiencing, and by the way, when your cells become inflamed, something very basic happens as well. We don't get the good things in the cell. And what happens is there's a place in your cell called the mitochondria. That's where we make energy, ATP, and we feel good. Everything works wonderful. And a lot of people with brain fog are just not making enough cell energy. But all is well. But when we make cell energy, we also make toxins that have to be exported outside the cell. Our body has pathways to do that, glutathione and other things that bring the toxins out of the cell. And when that happens, we feel amazing. But when the cell becomes inflamed, we don't bring toxins out, and we don't get the good nutrients in. That's a recipe for disaster. This inflammation is blocking our hormone receptors, causing hormone resistance, causing us to feel bad. But I tell you this to say, this is why your diet change isn't working anymore. When you used to change your diet, lose 10 pounds, feel better, now you're going, I've changed my diet, I still don't feel well. Oh, this is why your hormones stop working. A lot of people taking bioidentical hormones going, it made my blood levels look better. And I thought I even felt better in the beginning, but now it's not, right? And you have to take more and more of the hormones. So Yes, bioidentical hormones are healthier, if you will, than taking just regular synthetic hormones that your doctor might give you. But the fact is it's still not dealing with the big problem. Toxins in these bad fats are driving inflammation. So toxins are attracted to fat. So if I draw these little X's on the cell membranes, these X's, absolutely, the toxins are driving inflammation. Three big causers. Bad fats, we talked about it. Glucose and insulin spikes will drive cellular inflammation. And the third one, and it's the biggest one, and it is these toxins. So those are the three drivers of cellular inflammation. And again, what does that mean to you? The brain fog, the anxiety, I'm getting fat, don't know why. All of it. That's really what it means.
All right. So the big three: vegetable oils or seed oils. You mentioned toxins. Is that things like glyphosate that we talked about earlier?
Yes, glyphosate is absolutely one that allows even these chemicals to cross even into the cells, right? And many chemicals do. And now these membranes, I didn't talk about these inner membranes on your mitochondria. They're even more fragile than the outer membranes. And when they get affected, now our cell energy goes down. The lower cell energy goes, of course, the worse you feel. However, there's something else that happens. It's called the Gibbs free energy equation. Glutathione levels, we'll just say that's called GSH. That's the abbreviation for glutathione. The lower energy in the cell goes, the lower glutathione goes, and the more toxins that build up in the cell. And therefore, the Gibbs free energy equation says that equals greater inflammation. So energy drops, glutathione drops, inflammation increases. Bad combination. So
okay, let me jump back in. I didn't mention the third one, just to summarize there. The third one was insulin and blood glucose. And I just want to jump in with what you just shared there, the mitochondria. Could that be looked at as a microcosm of what we've been talking about then with the bigger cell membrane?
Yes, it is. It is, and arguably even more fragile, oxidizes even more. And again, when that happens, when that mitochondrial membrane becomes inflamed, now you produce less energy. Less energy equals more inflammation. More inflammation equals nothing works. More problems, more brain fog, more anxiety. I can't sleep. Nothing's working. Nothing's working. That's what it equals. Right. So think of cellular inflammation equals nothing works. I don't feel good and I don't know why. And my doctors aren't helping me, even my darn alternative doctors. My diet doesn't work. So I'm inflammation equals that, if that makes, sense.
So is what you're saying there, all this equals inflammation, and that's the top driver of disease that we're feeling, the symptoms we're feeling day in, day out.
Yeah. And so when we look at, I mentioned the word super toxin, right? Like, we're surrounded by a lot of plastics, and yes, they're endocrine disruptors, but your body's natural defenses can get rid of these things, right? Now, I argue that we are overwhelmed with them. But when you think of things like glyphosate, it is a super toxin because it devastates the protective barriers. The gut, first protective barrier, blood-brain barrier, first protective barrier, and then it affects the cell membrane, opens it up, right? Becomes more toxic in the cell. Heavy metals do a similar thing. Just by their name, heavy, they're hard to get rid of. Glutathione doesn't even do a great job of getting rid of heavy metals, and they tend to accumulate, right? So they tend to stay in the body. And once somebody has a lot of heavy metal accumulation, called bioaccumulation, their cellular natural detox pathways get decimated. And now you start accumulating all these other toxins. So a super toxin kind of drives more inflammation. A super toxin devastates your glutathione in your cells, all the natural things your body does to get rid of toxins. And now you start building out more of these plastics, forever chemicals. Now all these hormone disruptors. Now it's like doesn't matter if you even limit them. Your body's holding on to them because we've crushed your natural ability. So, one of the things that I've taught for 20 years is, how to teach doctors, and, now I'm bringing it more directly to the public than ever, what we can do to get rid of some of these super toxins to upregulate our pathways again.
I believe earlier you used the term super sources. Is that the same as the super toxins?
Yeah.
Okay. And those, just so I understand fully, those are building up in the cell membrane as well, the toxins.
Yeah. And they drive massive inflammation. All right. Heavy metals are devastating to the cell membranes, cell detox pathways. And by the way, R3, it was restoring cell energy. I made the point that as cell energy drops because of toxins building up in the cell, the body's natural glutathione levels that get rid of toxins drop, and then the body's inflammation or the cell's inflammation increases. So we have to get our cells' energy up. And by the way, I think that's why you see a lot of talk about ozone therapies, because they help cell energy, red light therapy. If you look at cytochrome P450, it's this pathway in our mitochondria where we make energy that's vital for energy. Well, that's a photon pathway too. So meaning that cytochrome is cyto meaning cell, chrome meaning color. So these wavelengths of light actually help us make energy. So that's why I think people benefit from some of these wavelengths like red light, getting in the sun. Yes, it does make a difference in our cell's energy. But if we don't restore the cell energy, if you don't get rid of the toxins that are just crushing cell energy, you can sit in the front of red light all you want, sit in the sun outside all you want. You go, why doesn't it work for me? Because you have so much inflammation driven by toxins and bad fats that, it will not work for you until you deal with that. That's the message that I teach.
So you talked about the fact that when this is happening, glutathione in the cell is decreasing. You mentioned that it's not a really good thing for detoxifying heavy metals. But what do you think about glutathione as a supplement during the healing phase, where we're talking about now, where the cells are damaged, and beyond, to, again, like the red light, we got to get to the source here, but as a tool for healing?
Look, I think glutathione plays a role, but there's some myths that we have to bust. An IV glutathione gets it past the gut, puts it right into the blood, but be clear, it doesn't get into the cell. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't help, because you have a lot of oxidation, inflammation outside the cell that it could combat, and it does. So people do glutathione IVs, and it helps them. Now, with technology, we can take it in a liposome form, which puts it in a little fat particle that crosses the gut, because it would be devastated in the gut normally. So liposome is better because it gets into the bloodstream like an IV. But be clear, the marketing that says it gets into the cell, it does not. Liposome does not help things get into the cell. It helps it get through the gut. So liposome vitamin C helps it get through the gut more, but not into the cell. Glutathione, same thing. But again, not against it. I'm just being clear that it doesn't get into the cell. And the reason I make that clarity is because intracellular, in the cell, glutathione is the problem. Now, there are certain forms of glutathione, one called acetylglutathione, that does get a little bit into the cell. There has been a new glutathione, and it's called glycerol glutathione. He combined it to a dextrin, because on the cells there's dextrin receptors, and he's proven that gets into the cell better. I have developed a few products that raise intracellular glutathione, but it does it via N-acetylcysteine is a part of the 3 peptides that make glutathione in the cell. So N-acetylcysteine does help intracellular glutathione, but also you have to, because when the cell gets toxic, you waste the glutathione. So you have to bring it back to a reduced form from an oxidized form. Toxins oxidize, meaning it uses it up, but it has to be recycled. So I've developed products to help us recycle it. It's very important for people who have exhausted their glutathione. So yes, that's the glutathione talk. It is important, but you have to be cautious of the forms you're taking.
All right, let's move into the third R. I think you mentioned it's cellular energy.
Yeah, third R was to restore cell energy.
Okay, anything else we want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned some of the biohacks that people are doing today. Light does help, right? Red lights, different light therapies do help. Sitting in the sun helps. That has a full spectrum of light. Don't get burnt. But I think that there are some more mitochondrial products on the market today that can be very helpful. But again, helpful to the point if we don't get rid of these big, big insults to our mitochondria, then we're going to continue to spin our wheels. We're not, remember R1, we have to remove the sources, reduce the sources, and then some of these other biohacks can work better. Some of the supplements can actually work better.
All right, before we move to the fourth R, let's make sure we've covered all the sources clearly. I know we have the vegetable oils again, the glyphosate. Let's, before we move forward, talk about other major insults in that realm.
I think we have to look at heavy metals a little more closely. And I think the problem there is there's a lot of myths around heavy metals that you're going to take cilantro, chlorella, and just get rid of them. Sit in a sauna and just get rid of them. It's not that simple. And you're not going to do an IV chelation and just get rid of them. Arguably, that can make you worse because something like EDTA or DMPS, these are real chelators. They do grab metals very well, but they go into the body and they go out and take some toxins with them. But what happens is the blood level drops within 10 hours, 12 hours, and now you've created a new problem because you have a redistribution of heavy metals. Because when you set up what is called a concentration gradient, you grab a lot, they go away, and now the body starts letting go, and then you redistribute those metals. That's why you hear horror stories of IV chelation. IV chelation works great if you have an acute exposure. You just got this massive exposure, do IV chelation. You can grab a lot at once, and it actually be helpful. But chronic exposures where these metals accumulate in your tissue, and that's one of the problems with heavy metals. They work their way into the brain, as mercury does. And where are the big sources? Silver fillings. You shouldn't see silver fillings in people's mouths anymore, but you do. And here's the problem. Maybe you didn't have any. Did your mother have them? There's a study called the Drash study. Ladies, the number of silver fillings that contain 50% mercury that vaporizes into your brain, as long as that filling is in your mouth, 30 years, still vaporizing mercury every time you chew, drink hot liquids, and that turns to inorganic mercury. And there's a proper way to get rid of it. I teach it. But the point is that Drash study showed that the number of silver fillings in mom's mouth was proportional to how much mercury we find in the baby's brain. And that's autopsy studies, very accurate. And we accumulate it from utero, and then we start getting our own fillings. Contact lens fluid in the 70s, 80s, early 90s had pure mercury in it, right? Form of thimerosal, ethyl mercury. And all these other sources from factories to food, like fish and et cetera. I mean, we can go on and on. We accumulate it. It stays in the body. Oh, and today we add one more lethal problem. Is the aluminum that we're being exposed to. Yes, in your antiperspirants, using aluminum foil around food, acid food, fatty foods, don't do that, right? But it's also coming in the form of rain. Why? Because they're putting it in jet fuel to make it more efficient. They save millions of dollars. This new jet fuel in the last 10 years is a problem. Falling from the sky is aluminum, and it's into our water and into our soil. Oh, and just acid rain by itself causes aluminum to release into the water and the food. It's the second most abundant element in the Earth's crust, but it releases and now becomes more toxic. So we're being inundated with aluminum. You put aluminum and mercury together, it's deadly for the brain. Oh, and one more perfect storm. Glyphosate, as you remember, I said opens up the blood-brain barrier, 2012 MIT Stephanie Seneff study, and allows the mercury and the aluminum to cross deeper in the brain. And she believes is causing this explosion of all these neurodegenerative conditions, brain fog alone. So yes, heavy metals are a problem. The other problem is the amount of mold that we're being exposed to in this country in particular is different than Europe. Why? Because the way we build buildings, sealed tight with plastic wrap. That's the way we trap moisture and chemicals in our buildings. drywall that has mold food on it, paper, literally cellulose is mold food. Just add water. This is the way we build homes. How many people have had leaks and they just go, oh, it's the guy, we fixed the leak, and they do nothing about it? You now have a chronic mold problem that releases biotoxins into your airspace. Your attic leaks, you don't even know it. Your basement, has positive positive water pressure, and it gets wet every once in a while. No big deal. It just happens every once in a while. Oh yeah, that's a mold problem causing you and your family to get sick. HVAC systems, air conditioning units, especially in humid climates, people don't keep their fans running all the time. So the coil where it chills the air it creates mold, like a glass, that's cold water in a hot summer humid day becomes wet on the outside. That's what's happening in your HVAC. So the point is we are inundated with biotoxins from mold. These aren't normal toxins. When you have, one of the ways we know someone has a mold problem is they get fat fast. And all of a sudden they have all these hormone problems. Their hair starts falling out and they've done everything and they can't figure it out. You might be in a mold issue, all right? Because that's how devastating it is, right? So mold is a big hidden problem. And I'll throw one more out. Hidden infections in the jaw devastate people. We've learned now that you can't just pull a wisdom tooth out and expect a good outcome 25 years later. They heal over, no pain, but now infection gets in there and it goes into your bloodstream. And yes, it drives autoimmune, unexplainable illnesses, all these bad things, decimates the gut, normal flora. So all of these things, root canals, same thing. We've made some great errors here that we've learned now. And unfortunately, biological dentists, they don't even still understand a lot about cavitation. The hidden infections, mold and heavy metals, those are massive of what it's setting up in disease in this country.
Just so we don't overwhelm people, how do they go about assessing their body, their environment, given all you just shared, in a practical way? Obviously, there's not just one test that can check for all this, but do you have a systematic way that people can go through this and make sure that they have a clean bill of health to begin all this?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously for mold, there's a simple test. Right now, there's a test, it's a urine test for biotoxins that people can take. Your alternative doctor can give you that test. The problem is it's also testing for food mold. So because I train doctors, we have found that it's just not so accurate. Meaning there's a lot of people that are not in a mold exposure that have very high levels because their coffee, the grains they're eating have a lot of the mold. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. I think the most accurate test is a visual contrast sensitivity test. You can go online and put in vcstest.com. V as in Victor, C as in cat, S as in Sam, test.com. And you can, I think it's a $10 or $15 donation, as they call it. You can take the test online and get an accurate assessment. If you fail that test, it's not measuring acuity, your ability to see, it's measuring contrast, which if you're in a mold exposure, gets just absolutely decimated. It doesn't work for kids. It does work for adults. So I would start there. Had that heavy metal test, that meta-oxy test, is good. If you go to pompaprogram.com, I did a training there, and I give access to that test. There you could watch that. But that's a good place to start. If you have cellular inflammation, you're not going to feel well, and it's a good sign you have a neurotoxic issue. So especially if you've changed your diet and you still don't feel well, yeah, you probably have a neurotoxic issue. So those are some of the easier tests to do. If you are wondering about your home, air testing is very inaccurate. You don't waste your money on someone coming in and doing an air mold test. Useless. There's a better test called an ERMI. And it's not much money. But it does give you a more accurate assessment looking at the dust in your home. But be clear, it's showing a history of the home. So if there was a past history that got remediated correctly, it still might be in the dust if they've never had it, the dust, thoroughly cleaned well. But ERMI is more accurate to test your home. So there's some tips.
I think at this point it'd be helpful to share your story with heavy metals, which relates to what you were saying before with the mercury fillings, and then take us through that process of learning and trying different things to where you eventually got and what is actually effective for removing these metals.
Great question. Start with my story and we'll answer the question, what actually works. But okay, I started back in 1999 and I had a very busy practice at that time. 2 young boys, marriage going great, everything going great. So life was good. As I say, I was doing a lot of training, arguably the best shape, at least cardiovascularly in my life. I was doing bike races. I was probably riding 300 miles a week, even still going to the gym, busy practice. And then fatigue started. So of course you just think you're overtraining, backed up the training. Oh no, it didn't work. Then it went from fatigue to weird anxiety. Then it went from that to where I can't sleep. Wake up in the middle, I couldn't get back to sleep. And the fatigue would get worse. The brain fog started. I was like, what is going on? At that point, I stopped exercise because if I rode 5 miles on my bike, let alone 100, I'd be wiped out. I couldn't handle it. Then my digestion, allergic, chasing foods, gluten, this, that. I mean, just like most people. Didn't know what was wrong, and the sleep and the anxiety became, absolutely horrible. It made life very difficult. I couldn't even handle loud noise. My kids crying, my wife would have to take them out of the house. My adrenals were shot. And like I was saying earlier, I chased my adrenals and my thyroid because my hair was thinning. I mean, everything that I knew my thyroid wasn't working right. And I found online Mad Hatter's disease. What is that? People making felt hats were using mercury as part of the process, and they were known as Mad Hatters, right? Alice in Wonderland story, But the Mad Hatter, I was a Mad Hatter. Even unexplainable anger, I was a Mad Hatter. Anxiety, all of it. And I went and got a blood test. As a matter of fact, I went to the top head of toxicology, Allegheny Research, or Allegheny General Hospital in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, top in the world, and did $5,000 worth of blood tests that my insurance did not pay for. One of which was a mercury test. Came out normal levels. Over a year later, I was working with a very bright endocrinologist. And because I was still chasing my thyroid issues, he said, Dan, I think you have mercury toxicity. I said, I thought so too. No, didn't. What test did you? Blood test. Wrong test. That would be showing if you had an acute, like the Mad Hatters. If you had acute, meaning daily exposure, it would show up in your blood. But if it's chronic, it goes from the blood into the tissues and it doesn't test in your blood. You have to challenge it out of your tissues, and then you might see it. But even then, what's in your brain, you don't see. It's too deep without biopsy. So anyways, he was right. I did have a mercury problem. And I said, where do you think I got it? He said, did you have any dental work done around when this started? I said, maybe. So I looked at my cycling journal. There it was. And days after, I had 2 amalgam fillings removed incorrectly. My good friend did it. He didn't mean anything by it. He just didn't know better at the time. But when they drilled on that, it vaporized even more mercury. But by the way, be clear. That mercury was it comes off of the fillings in a form of mercury vapor, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it turns to inorganic mercury, and it stays there for life. So those of you who say, well, thank God I had my fillings out, even if you did it from a biological dentist, and there is a safer method to do it, even if you did it that way, that inorganic mercury is still in your brain, only to give you a diagnosis later or cause more problems, which typically starts with brain fog. But it's there. And part of what I've been teaching for 20 years is how to get rid of it safely, right? And I learned it all out of this. I had to get my own life back. But what the study shows, it accumulates in the brain in different parts, but mostly in the pituitary hypothalamus. Guess what that does? Controls our hormones, controls our thyroid, controls our adrenals, controls the feedback loops that keep everything normal and right. So no wonder all my efforts for my hormones weren't working. There was absolutely, the control tower was messed up. So the bottom line is that all of what I teach now came out of getting rid of that stuff. You know what I found out later too? Is because when I started getting the mercury out of my brain, my anxiety went away. I was able to sleep through the nights, but I still was not right. I learned that I was reacting to low levels of mold. And I learned that my house had a low level of mold. When I moved out of that house, another level of healing happened. So I learned a lot. And now working with, so many people, even through my doctors and coaches, one of the things that we look for is infections here, heavy metal exposures throughout their life. And then we bring them through a process. And to answer the second part of what you asked, how do you get it out? Those 5 R's that we were discussing, and we didn't get through all of them, but is a roadmap of how we upregulate those pathways that are broken in the cell. My saying is we have to fix the cell to get well, but we have to detox the cell. Real detox is at the cell. If we don't fix that, we're never going to be able to deal with this problem. So a sauna, chelators, although they can be part of a great detox program, they don't fix that necessarily. We have to specifically fix these membranes, specifically fix the cell energy. And we'll talk about the other ones in a moment, but that's part of it. Okay, so if you think about that, that's step 1 to real detox. Step 2 is utilizing chelators correctly and binders correctly, because when you start moving the toxins from the cell, now they will redistribute to other places. So now this is when chelators can be used. And that's a whole nother conversation, because we don't use IV because, as I mentioned, it'll pull out a lot, it goes away, and we have redistribution. We use oral chelators so we can keep the levels up in the blood long enough so when we stop using them, we don't get that redistribution. So chelators are used as we upregulate cell function. And then we also use gut binders. The reason we do that is because many of these toxins are brought to the liver, where they bind to bile. Bile is dumped into the gut to be used as in digestion, but it brings the toxins there, and we can auto-intoxicate from the gut. So we have to bind them in the gut to pull them out. So we're using chelators around the cell to move it all the way out safely, and we're using binders in the gut to move it all the way out safely as we fix the cell. In a nutshell, that's my process that I've taught for 20 years.
All right. I want to highlight a couple things that
There's a lot
through
there.
that. Yeah, there is.
Sorry.
One thing that I think is super important to address is the fact that you had testing done for mercury and it came back negative because they were testing the blood, and this was deep within your brain. So of the people that are testing this, how many of them are testing the blood versus actually testing what's going on in the brain? And then on top of that, what is the proper test that's going to see what's going on in the brain?
Most people are testing in the blood or the urine. And again, if we see it in urine, that's odd, because your body's getting rid of it and you're probably a healthy person. Hair is often used. The autism study showed that autistic kids, you never see it. Matter of fact, that's the red flag. You don't see any mercury. Well, you should, because when your body's getting rid of it, it should show up in the hair. So, we look at mineral ratios in hair as a more accurate way of looking if you have a heavy metal issue, not heavy metals themselves. Blood's not accurate. Urine's not accurate. So what way, to your question, can we make it a little more accurate? By challenging it out. You take a water-soluble chelator like DMPS or DMSA orally, and you take a lot at once, and then that pulls it from the tissue. And then now you test it in the urine. The reason the urine is because it's water-soluble. It comes out mostly in the urine. And most of it doesn't go to the gut, but through the urine. So it makes it an accurate assessment. It is inaccurate for brain mercury because a lot of people that have major problems, it's locked here. Their body levels are too low. So they'll test not high. So there's every test for heavy metals has challenges, unless we're actually doing biopsy, but who's going to do that? No one. So the point is that I did a body load challenge test where we take a chelator, and you can't just take a bunch of chelator at once. You have to stay on it for at least 3 days. So when you stop, you don't get this redistribution. So I learned that the hard way, right? But that's how we test. And then it gives us some idea of what's locked in the tissue. And that is the best reflection we have.
And when you're explaining the mercury fillings, it sounded like, but I'll have you confirm, anybody that has had those is going to have something in their brain, or even if their mother had those while they're in utero, they're going to have some up there too.
Exactly. And it is the brain mercury that causes most of the problems that we're seeing. And it is in a form of inorganic mercury, which lasts longer, half-life is longer than you live. So yes, even if you got your fillings out, that mercury is still locked in there. And then I said something very quickly in passing earlier. I said we add aluminum to that, and now we have a really big problem on our hands, because we know aluminum also is a nasty neurotoxin that goes into the brain, drives massive brain problems. So you put mercury and aluminum together, and you have a higher lethal dose value. What that means is, in studies, they can give a rat this much mercury and kill a certain amount of rats, right? Half the rats. But what they've realized is if they give them fraction of the mercury with a fraction of aluminum, you kill double the rats. Higher lethal dose value when you have lower levels of both. So you put those two things together, there's a nasty synergy. Same thing with lead. Lead and mercury together are more deadly than one by the other. And you guess where your first big lead exposure is? Mom. It's very normal. Most lead is stored in the bone. Our mothers grew up in the lead generation, meaning lead was everywhere. Gasoline, the air, every bit of soil, everything had lead, lead, lead. They store it in the bone. It's part of, where the body protecting itself, but also where it exists. But here's the problem: is during pregnancy, it's very normal to lose bone, but out comes the lead in utero. When I lecture on this topic, I show my wife's test, and her lead is literally off the chart. Guess where she got it? Her mother, who ended up dying of cancer, estrogen-driven cancer, which lead was affecting. And my wife had hormone problems. Her lead was affecting it. And guess what my kids were having? All of a sudden, they had all these weird gut problems, etc. We tested their levels off the chart. They got it from my wife, who got it from her mother. It's estimated 4 generations of inheritance. You take the lead, the mercury, and the aluminum. You wonder why thyroid cases have gone through the roof. Oh, and then we add this glyphosate that went through the roof in the late 90s, 2000s, which allows these things to go deeper. It's a perfect storm. We add plastic and forever chemicals to this. Forget it. I mean, this is where we're at, Jess, right?
Well, to me, it seems like the way you're explaining this, we're going to all be affected to some level, and not just a small level. Given what we've explained so far, it sounds like very significant. And I'd have to imagine somebody like you or even me who are in the know doing an ongoing detox would have to be part of a healthy protocol for somebody that wants to maintain their health these days.
I agree.
Talk about that piece, because you've done the work now, and I want to get to more of that story at the end, what you actually did and how long it took to get that out of your brain. But also on top of that, given the modern world and all this doomsday we're talking about, I would have to assume we're going to need to do some maintenance, even if we are eating organic, grass-fed, and being mindful of all these different inputs, because the modern world is just a cesspool.
I don't want to paint a picture of no hope, but I also don't want to water it down, right? When you look at the amount of diseases that are escalating, it's pretty scary, but we're not seeing those same numbers in Europe because their exposure is lower. But we're starting to see thyroid raise, right? Because there's certain things that are unavoidable on the planet. But I love this. I take oftentimes 2 glasses of water, one filled all the way to the top. Okay. And showing a little bit of stress causes this overflow, which imagine that to be the brain fog, the anxiety, the symptoms we don't like, the gut problems, right? A little bit of stress. So, how does this person live a normal life? Well, they're barely living. Well, if we can empty that bucket even to halfway, right, we can stress it a lot more. And then if I take this glass where it's even a quarter of the way and I really stress it, nothing, no symptoms, that's where we want to get. I would make the argument you'll never empty the glass, right? But if we can get it to here where I am now, right? I was this, but if we can get it to here, then we can live a normal life. So how do we do that, right? We definitely have to limit what comes in. We already talked about that, right? So let's limit what we come, do the best we can, right? Eating from the clean 15, like let's minimize this. But what I've taught with my cellular detox is how to empty the bucket. And I believe if we focus on these super toxins, the ones that just decimate us, now the cells start to do what they do, and then we can easily get that halfway and live a normal life, right? So to your point, to be healthy today, it's not as simple as just changing the diet. I think that 20 years ago it was. Most people changed their diet, they lost weight, they felt better, all the symptoms went away. Today, we're not dealing with that, right? Matter of fact, arguably, people can't even stay on a diet because they're hormonally disrupted, because their cells can't use fat for energy, so their body gives them cravings because they just don't want to die, right? It's like, so part of the survival mechanism is leading to diet failure. I mean, so it's not your fault, folks. But the point is that if we can just add to our family, one of the things that I started doing, Jess, is instead of just teaching doctors, I've opened up a certification program for the average person who wants to be certified in what I've taught. Because on this show right here, we can't get into every nuance, right? I put together a certification of everything I've taught for 20 years for a price that the average person can just be like, I'm doing this just for me and my kids. And what I teach, I still do. I'm not detoxing all the time. Every once in a while, I do a cycle, is what it's called. 3 days or 4 days of doing things that keep my cells working and keep my cells unloading. So think of our cells as that bucket. If I can keep that empty, my cells, and now I can live life normal. That's the goal, right? So, some basic things that we can learn. My certification program now takes people through. If you go to healthcenters.com, anyone can listen. I would take the certification and you'll learn what you need to be healthy. Everything. You'll even learn my fasting strategies, my diet strategies, but you'll learn my cellular detox strategies. So I just started that last year for the first time because I realized what you realize, right? If we're going to truly impact, everybody needs to know this. And I don't say it like I'm so smart, Jess. I don't. I only learned it because God had mercy on me. And this is a true story. My wife literally crying out for answers from me because it destroyed our family. I wasn't the husband. I wasn't the dad that I was. And I wasn't the doctor that I was, right? So crying out for answers on her needs, God spoke to her heart. Not only am I going to get him well, but he's going to take a message to the world. She would tell me that. I would get angry because my argument was I can't even get myself well, let alone take a message to the world. Now, here I am, right? I mean, everything that I teach came out of that, and God led me to it. The 5 R's and what we need to fix and upregulate, how to empty the bucket. I mean, he led me there, so certifying people in that process, it's my passion.
All right. Well, we're going to link up that certification in the show notes. We still have a little bit of time here, but I want to make sure we tie up a few loose ends. The last 2 R's, we may have addressed what's under those, but talk about what those are for completeness.
R number 4 is you have to reduce cellular inflammation. Now, that seems obvious, right? But how do we do that? Yeah, I've developed some products around it. I actually have that one. It's called Inflam R4. That's R4, right? In it is some cleverness, right? We take mushrooms, we grow them on things like turmeric, which we know in studies show an amazing effect on cellular inflammation. But unfortunately, a lot of what's in studies we can't utilize at the cellular level. But if we grow a mushroom on it, we can pull it up into a mushroom and actually make it bioavailable. That technology is in this product. But Hey, look, I'm not selling a product here. I want the concept for people to get. A lot of the dietary strategies that I talk about and teach help with the inflammation. Getting rid of the bad oils. We discussed it. That's step one of reducing inflammation, right? Feast famine cycling, where we fast or famine and then feast. Believe it or not, I find myself, excuse me, I find myself at seminars now telling people, because fasting is in vogue. When I studied fasting in the 90s, no one was into fasting. But now I find myself saying to people, the feast is as important as the fast. People are fasting too much and putting themselves in a catabolic state. You have to feast and famine like ancient cultures were forced to do. And we can really drive down inflammation through fasting strategies done correctly. Changing diet alone actually helps create a more diverse microbiome, which downregulates cellular inflammation. I'm a proponent of every diet. Vegan diets, love them. Vegetarian diets, love them. Carnivore diets, love them. Keto diets, love them. Okay, which one's best? None of them. The change is best. Meaning, if you stay in a vegan diet too long, you're going to get sick. Vegetarian diet, you'll get sick. If you stay in a carnivore diet too long, you're going to get sick. So it makes sense that every ancient culture did, in fact, utilize these diets. They were forced to be in and out of them. The magic is the change. When we change diets seasonally or just purposely, we increase diversity of our microbiome. That means we create all this diversity in organisms, which improves our immune system and downregulates inflammation. Studies prove my point. The problem is it's hard to change our diets. We tend to want to eat the same 8 foods, especially those in our health space. The more health conscious you are, the greater chance you're eating the same 8 foods. It's true, because you found the 8 foods that you seem to do the best with, and that diet helped you. You came from the standard American diet, went to a vegan diet or vegetarian diet, it helped you. You felt better. You went from the standard American diet into a keto diet, that diet helped you. You felt better. So therefore, you stay there. Low carb too long, the body will think it's starving and it creates more inflammation. I mean, I can make the argument for any of the diets. We train people to shift their diet. It's hard. It's hard to change people.
Okay, given what you just said there, when it comes to the diet or fasting, it's not about finding the perfect one of either of those. We got to keep changing things up. We'll get to fasting, but diet specifically, are there certain principles? Obviously, we know organic, we've talked about. We've talked about vegetable oils. We want to remove those. But given that you do embrace the full spectrum of all the diets you name there, what are some other guiding principles
Across the board.
Across the board that we have to follow besides the 2 I mentioned?
Yeah, and this applies to whatever diet you're on, right? Processed food, right? When I say it's good to eat high healthy carbohydrate diets for a period of time, that doesn't mean you're just eating all, pizza and refined carbohydrates. So the less processed foods are going to be healthier. Eat real food. That's across the board. If you can't read it, don't eat it. What does that mean? You go into the grocery store and say, well, Dr. Pompa, I don't know what all these words are. Then just don't eat it, because chances are it's bad if you can't read it. Maybe not always, but it's a good standard to go by, right? If they have bad, you can easily identify the bad oils and know what to look at on a label. So some label reading, avoiding the bad fats, avoiding the toxins, chemicals if you can't read it, don't eat it. And then I'll give another basic principle. If God created it, it's typically good. If man messed with it, it's typically bad. Meaning, I'm going to use dairy as an example. If you eat raw, like real dairy of a cow that eats grass, it's literally one of the healthiest foods you can eat, the cheese, the dairy. But yet commercial dairy is one of the most toxic foods on the planet. I mean, how about that for a dichotomy, right? It's like, how confusing is that for people, right? It's like we pasteurize it, homogenize it, antibiotics, chemicals, destroy the food. Commercial dairy is not even a food. But yet every ancient culture on the planet has used dairy is a mainstay oftentimes of their diet because it's nutrient dense. Cows eat grass that are nutrient, and they take it up into their, all these fat soluble vitamins that people lack today, minerals. It's dense in dairy, right? It's dense in meat too, but even more so in some respects in dairy, and yet it also can be stored in fermented cheese, things like that, right? You get all the healthy fats. So that's confusing. So if man altered it, stay away from it, right? God created it, it's probably good. So the more altered the food, stay away from it. So those are just some principles you can go by, and that crosses all diets.
Another one I heard you talk about in one of your videos is latitude and making sure if you're going to eat a food, it can be grown at that latitude that you live. And I really like that one. So if you're up in Canada, where I am, bananas don't grow up there. But if you're down in Florida and you can grow a banana and you're exposed to, I'll have you talk more about the principle, but I feel like it's because we're exposed to those, the sunshine and the different elements there, that we can handle that food. So talk more about that piece.
It's so true, right? I mean, our latitude, definitely determines the foods that grow there, which, there's so much growing science on our microbiomes adjust to this and now adjust to those foods. But how does your brain know what latitude you're even at? Through the eyes, the light. I mean, that's cool, right? So your brain knows when you're in a northern latitude, equatorial place, based on the light, the curvature, and it makes total sense when you understand that. So I use that example of a banana because there's so much debate in our space. Are bananas healthy? There's a group that says they're not. There's a group that said, debate. It's like, well, you look at these people that live in tropical places and they eat bananas and they have no problem. But if you're people that are eating bananas in northern climates where they don't grow, there appears to be a problem. So maybe that applies to every food. I believe it does. It's like, so if you're eating a lot of your diet up in a tropical diet and you live in Canada, you're going to have problems with that because your microbiome is adjusting to the latitude you're at, right? So, and of course, nature provides. If you live at that latitude and your brain knows you're at that latitude, nature is going to provide what you need. It's that smart. Innate intelligence is that smart. So, yeah, I think of course now you're at that latitude and you always have changes, right? No matter what, right? Even equatorial areas, the things that grow change, and it forces a diet change based on what's growing there, right? It's like if we ate what was growing here in Utah, we would be forced into a seasonal diet change. And we note that our microbiome changes as the seasons change. Oh, this makes so much sense. So when I'm teaching diet variation, if I taught that complexity of eat what grows, because people go into a grocery store and they have access to it all, it's like, it's just too much for them. But yet the principle still applies.
Another layer to that too, as we're talking about it, that I think about is the fact we've hybridized so many of these fruits and vegetables. So even a banana these days that we can get at the grocery store, whether you're in Florida or in Canada, is likely so different from the original banana.
Yeah.
You could take that and extrapolate it to so many different fruits and vegetables. So that clouds the water there a bit. And I don't even know where to take that. That's another layer.
Where you take that is back to the principle, if God made it, eat it. If man altered it, don't, right? It's like, because if you think about it, right, like wheat, man altered wheat to dwarf wheat, which, it survives. Norman Borlaug, if you go to our capital in DC, there's a statue of him, right? There's Norman. He won a Nobel Prize, man. It's like he hybridized, he made dwarf wheat, but yet he created this new gluten that most people, I don't know, the percentage of people, that's debatable, but a percentage of people do not do well with, right? Well, good old Norman actually saved a lot of people because dwarf wheat absolutely, it's better in drought. It's better in all environmental stresses. So that's why they gave him a Nobel Prize. but he also created a new gluten that our bodies don't recognize. And when you have leaky gut because of toxins, and that gluten goes across, make antibodies, autoimmune. So poor Norman didn't know what he was doing. But the point is we altered what God created, right? When you go to Italy and those places, they still eat the ancient, it's a very tall wheat that doesn't have that gluten. And many people that have gluten sensitivity can eat that wheat and eat that gluten and not have a problem, right? So if man created it or altered it, dairy, wheat, stay away from it.
And now we're heading into a whole nother layer to that as well. GMOs. Lab grown meats. And we're just on the continuum here, and things unfortunately aren't heading in a great direction.
No, we're not. Corn, but think about it. Europe is banning these things. It's look, I'm grateful to live in this country because it is still the land of opportunity, whereas Europe is not necessarily. But I'll tell you, they've got it right when it comes to foods, and it's because they tend to protect their old way of living. Their winemaking, glyphosate is illegal. You can't change the way you make wine there. In Napa, it's a darn science experiment of chemicals. I don't drink Napa wine. I drink Italian, Spanish, French wine because they're basically outlawed all of those methods and chemicals. But they also are resistant to the GMOs. It's outlawed. Right? Now, Mexico finally said no more glyphosate, no more GMOs. Right? But here in the United States, Monsanto has a big foothold, stronghold. This is where we created it. And it's not good. It's not good.
A couple things you brought up in passing I'm curious about. Alcohol. You mentioned that you consume wine. Talk about how that can fit into a healthy lifestyle. And then gluten. Is that something you totally avoid? Or now that you're healed, can you have a little bit? How do you look at that?
When I was sick, I was very gluten sensitive, and I got rid of all of it. And matter of fact, I couldn't tolerate many grains at all. Maybe some of the ancient grains I did okay with, but now I can tolerate it. I can even eat gluten and I don't react at all. Matter of fact, I even did the most sensitive gluten tests and I didn't have one reactivity. That wasn't the case when I had leaky gut, leaky brain, so there is a time to avoid it. That's for sure. Now, again, if you have celiac disease, you'll never be able to eat gluten. Let me be clear. There's a different level of allergy, right? So, and again, I'm not making an argument that that form of gluten is a healthy thing. It's, if you have any form of leaky gut, it's not going to be healthy. But what was the second part of the question? It was
alcohol. You mentioned that you consume wine at least periodically. What does that look like, and how can that fit into a healthy lifestyle?
Yeah, I'm drinking about 3 bottles a day right now. No, I'm kidding. I don't drink that much alcohol, but the premise is hormesis, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. But when you look at all the blue zones, these are the areas of the world that have the highest number of centenarians, people living over 100, very healthy. They all drink a little bit of wine. It's like they all do. So it can't be that bad. But again, biblically, the Bible warns about drunkenness, right? And too much wine is not good. Too much alcohol. It is a toxin that has to be metabolized, and it creates aldehydes. Remember, I say those drive cellular inflammation. But a small amount of alcohol actually acts hormetically. Hormesis is a premise that I utilize for everything. It is a premise that most people violate and don't understand. So I think it's worth understanding, because with the popularity of biohacks, cold plunges, saunas, red lights, many people are violating this principle and not getting a benefit from a cold plunge, as an example, or a sauna, and even making it bad for you. So let's understand the premise so we don't make these mistakes. And it applies to fasting too. So the premise is, if we stress a biological system like ourselves, if the biological system adapts to the stress, it becomes a positive. Example of that is exercise. Exercise is a stress. That's how it works. If you adapt to the exercise, you get stronger faster, right? Makes sense? Okay. If you take that same premise and then you say, if you up the level of exercise to the point where we do this professional athlete's routine and you don't exercise a lot, you're a moderate exerciser, what will happen is you won't adapt to that level of stress and you actually get worse. Literally, you can show that your tissue broke down. You can show that you actually had a decline in hormone optimization, that your body was overstressed and everything that you need to actually become stronger went the wrong direction. There was a recent study showing that cold baths done too long actually caused the things in the muscle that they measured that break muscle down to increase and build muscle decrease when they did too much cold bath, right? So the point is that it's all about adaptation. If you fast too long, you may not adapt and something good becomes bad, right? So if we can adapt, then it's good. So if you drink too much alcohol, you're probably not going to adapt. And then it becomes a mass negative. I remember sitting through a brilliant scientist lecture, and I remember being challenged at my core. Mercury made me sick. And he put up a graph showing that a small amount of mercury in this rat study improved their cellular glutathione levels, their adaptation. And I was like, where is he? What? I couldn't, my brain couldn't accept it. And then he showed this massive improvement in the study that he did. And I'm thinking, this guy's off his rocker. But then he showed this massive decline. And he made the argument that mercury can cause, in this adaptation to survive, all these positive changes, but it is so toxic that it creates a sharp hormetic curve where you cross over into bad really fast. Whereas like something like exercise, it takes a little longer, and or maybe it's alcohol, it takes a little longer, but soon you can cross over and become bad. But what he proved was that just about anything can be a stress that, if you adapt to, can become a positive stress. So I mean, that is the premise that we have to apply, and that applies to emotional stress too. Arguably, if you take away someone all their emotional stress, they literally become useless. We need some level of stress. This generation, they argue the only stress that they had is COVID, right? And thank God they had COVID, but I mean, maybe social media is creating stressors. I believe it is, but they've had no great wars. They've had no great stressors, and it led to a softer, generation.
When you had mercury in the brain, I would assume drinking alcohol for you would be too much.
I couldn't do it.
Or if you start layering these on top of one another. So if you're having alcohol plus you're exercising too much, cold plunging. So I think we have to look at the interaction between them, and then also look at the person and where they're at along their healing journey, whether or not they can tolerate something like gluten again or alcohol.
That is a man who understands the principle right there. You nailed it, right? When I was sick, I would have one glass of wine. My heart rate would go up. I wouldn't sleep that night. Couldn't handle the stress. Oh, but remember what I said earlier too. I couldn't handle sound as a stress. Sound became too stressful for me. Loud sound, right? Oh, when I would go outside on a cold day, I would get a headache because I couldn't adapt to the cold of just outside, right? I couldn't take too hot of showers. You know why? It would leave me fatigued. You're right. Right. So where the more somebody's bucket is full, the less stress they can handle. If we can empty that, we can get them to endure more stress. We can get them to endure more chemicals. We can get them to endure more cold bath, right? Now maybe they can last a whole minute, whereas they couldn't last 10 seconds, right? So the mistake people are making is not knowing who they are, right? On that adaptation, you have to know who you are. I'm not saying cold bath's not good for you, but you may only be able to do 10 seconds. Isn't that the study? One of the recent studies on cold showed 10 seconds a day worked better than the 3 minutes. Most people, well, it's because they're probably studying average people who 3 minutes in a cold bath, they didn't adapt and got a negative. But 10 seconds of cold actually gave them a hormone optimization because it's all about survival, and they got a benefit. So it's like, but yet now everyone thinks that 10 seconds is the answer. No, it's what you can tolerate. So the question then is, how do I know, Dr. Pompa? Well, how did you feel later that day? More energy, less energy? How did you sleep that night? More energy, less energy? Oh, you can wear an Aura ring that shows your HRV. And if your HRV just plummeted, you probably did too much cold bath or maybe too much hot sauna, right? But in times that you're under a lot of stress, to Jess's point, is like, if you're under a ton of stress, then you probably should do less cold bath and maybe even less sauna, because you're probably not going to tolerate the same when you're under less emotional or more emotional stress or less.
We talked about the different food principles in a really general sense. We talked about fasting, and you got into the fact that it's about changing things up there. But I think before we fully leave the food piece, let's talk about a week, what that could look like with the fasting and feasting, how somebody could have those ebbs and flows and do that in a healthy way.
Okay, let's talk about something that a lot of people are doing, probably a lot of your listeners and viewers. Intermittent fasting daily. Is it good or bad? Is it good for women, bad for women? Is it good for people with thyroid conditions and adrenal problems, or bad for it? Everyone wants the black and white. And my answer never satisfies them. I say, well, it depends. So because of hormesis, right? So, but here's the thing that I've learned is people start intermittent fasting. For new people, that is eating in maybe a window of 4 hours, 1 or 2 meals in a 4 hour window. Maybe it's a 6 hour window, maybe it's 8 hour window. And then you're fasting through the night. Typically, it could be the other way around, but through the night. And then maybe you don't eat breakfast till noon. So you're fasting 15 hours, right? Or 18 hours, whatever it is. That's called intermittent fasting daily. When people start doing it, they always lose weight. Okay. I shouldn't say always, there's exceptions to every rule, but often lose weight. They feel great and it works because in that fasting window, you're forcing your body to use its own fast. You're naturally, decreasing some calories. I mean, all these things that actually work to lose weight, but something starts to happen. Over time, the body starts to go, I might feel like I'm starving. So I'm going to slow down fat metabolism. That means fat burning. And I'm going to hold on to the fat. And then the problem is because it goes into that fat saving mode to help you, to save your life, your body will start using muscle, especially during the night when it needs to make energy. So now you're losing muscle and gaining fat. And you can tell these people that are intermittent fasting and fasting too much because they start looking just that way. Skinny fat is what I call it. They start to lose their shape and they get fat in places that they don't want to get fat in. And they don't look good maybe without clothes on. So the point is that if you just add in 1 or 2 feast days where you don't eat in that window, you get up in the morning, eat breakfast, and you eat 3-4 meals that day. Do that 1 or 2 days a week, and your body goes, I'm not starving. Everything's cool. Feast, famine. That's a weekly feast, famine cycle. Arguably, people with thyroid and hormone problems actually do better from 3 feast days a week. So fast, eat in a 6 hour window, but then wake up the next day and eat 3-4 meals during the day. It works. Now, how do we do it monthly? Okay, ladies, this works. If you take your cycle, your period, as a rhythm that your body goes through hormonally, we know that the week before your cycle, it's good to feed hormones. Your body actually benefits from a little more carbohydrates. That's why you typically crave them. Chocolate, you crave the carbohydrates. I break my diet right, before my cycle all the time. I know when my cycle is coming because I crave carbohydrates. Just maybe innate intelligence is telling you something because your body actually takes and utilizes insulin and even glucose to make hormone transitions, right? And so your body's raising the level of hormones. So the time to feast would be a week before your cycle. A time to fast would be during your cycle, right? So you can use feast famine like that. So you can feast 5 days, 7 days the week before your cycle, and you can fast. And a fast doesn't just have to be water. A fast could be getting calories under 1,000 and protein under 20 grams. That's called a partial fast, where you're just famining, getting protein down, and you still break into something called autophagy where your body's still eating bad cells. So you could do a famine during your cycle even. So you do a feast and then a famine. That's a monthly cycle. And then we already talked about every season, change your diet. What if one season, in the winter, you're doing more keto, low carb, right? Like ancient cultures were forced to do. And then come spring, you start eating more berries and the fruits that come into ripeness. And you're forcing, your diet change by what's happening seasonally. That's diet variation too. So weekly, monthly, and seasonally, there's 3 examples.
And how do you feel about longer fasts? Having, say, like a water fast, 2-3 times a year, or extended fasting to fit into the yearly routine?
I love extended fasts. I believe one fast a year is transformative. I believe our DNA is set up to fast as well as feast. When ancient tribes had kill, boy, they feasted. They weren't limiting their protein intake or fat intake, I assure you. But when they didn't have it, they were forced into fasting, and our DNA is set up for it. During a fast, our body gets rid of bad cells, bad DNA, right? It does that cleaning. It cleans out its microbiome, resets your microbiome. All these amazing things happen. Body goes into a deeper level of healing. Too much of it, you get catabolic. So I am for fasting, but remember hormesis. Fasting is a stress. Many people go, I can't fast because this happens. You know what? You're right. You can't do an extended 5-7 day water fast. It's too stressful for you. So maybe you do a partial fast. I believe most people with metabolic challenges, thyroid, adrenal conditions, should partial fast. That's getting your calories under 1,000 and your protein under 20 grams daily. That's a partial fast. Do that for 5 days. And some of Walter Longo's studies show that they actually got more autophagy. Now, I disagree with Walter. He criticizes water fasts, but I say that no, if you're metabolically healthy and you can tolerate the stress of a water fast, you get a ton of benefit in autophagy. But a lot of people can't tolerate that stress and have to start with less. And I think that's where partial fasting fits in for many people who struggle to fast.
Okay. I want to wrap up a couple loose ends still before we part ways here. One of them being the 5 R's, which we've used as a central theme throughout the conversation. I've had you throughout the conversation articulate the first 4, but for completeness, what is the 5th one?
Yes, it is reestablishing something called methylation. Many people are familiar with it in our space because I have the MTHFR genotype. Okay, that means you might have trouble methylating. And yes, that creates slower cellular detox. And that's why it's essential. That it creates a problem with getting rid of toxic hormones, and they build up. And yes, that can drive cancer and other problems. It can create an increase in anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. However, I'm not a fan of the GenoSNP testing because number one, it labels people. And people go, oh my gosh, I'm homozygous. So, and they just they're stuck there. I don't like it for that aspect. And also, I don't like it because we've learned a lot. It's not as simple as these SNPs. We've learned that there's ways around these SNPs that innate intelligence uses. So it wasn't as simple as we thought just by labeling people SNPs. Is it a possibility if you're homozygous MTHFR that you might not be a great methylator? It's a possibility. It is. But I think as time has gone on, we've realized it's probably not as predictable as we thought, and it's way more complicated than we think. And I think time will continue to show that. But the methylation argument is vital. If methylation drops, and any stressor, physical, chemical, or emotional, can drop methylation. As that goes down, your body's ability to get rid of toxins, including glutathione, also drops. They parallel. Methylation is vitally important to protect your DNA and to detox a cell. We have to reestablish methylation. When someone doesn't feel great, when someone feels like, I'm toxic, my hormones aren't working, I already know they have methylation issues. I don't need a genotype to see that, right? So we treat it as such. And there are ways, taking methylated B vitamins like natural folate, B12 is beneficial, no doubt. But the methyl cycle is more than that. It's 21 steps around this thing, right? And so, I've developed some products around it. But methylation, reduce your stress.
All right, good place to end it is coming back to your story. We got to the part about testing, finding mercury in the brain. But let's talk about what you did to remove that and how long it took, and then what changes you noticed in your overall health as you healed that.
Yeah, I learned I first dealt with R number one, whereas I figured out how to get I think I had still two fillings in. I found out how to get those out safely because I learned that your brain won't let go as long as you have a source. Even if some people have sources underneath crowns and don't know it, and they struggle to detox, they can't detox correctly. Then we start looking under crowns for hidden sources. But I learned how to get it out properly, and then I learned how to get it out of the brain. And that is what I call my brain phase. And we use a chelator called ALA, and ALA, alpha lipoic acid, used very correctly, meaning you have to not violate half-life, is part of the process. I always give Andy Cutler and David Quigg credit here because they realize that ALA is one of the only things that moves inorganic mercury safely out of the brain. But you also have to use it with other chelators. So using something like DMSA, EDTA, DMPS, zeolite particles that are clean, other chelators with it also helps because it helps move it out of the body. All that I learned R number two, regenerating my membranes was essential because that's how things move in and out of the cell. R number three, I realized that if I didn't fix that energy issue, I couldn't detox. R4, I had to do everything to keep that inflammation at bay. And R5, I had to reestablish methylation. So then I realized that that really was the key. As long as I kept that moving, now the chelators used correctly, the gut binders used correctly, all that is a system. So think of it as three parts: the cell, the chelators to keep things moving out of the body instead of redistributing, and then the gut binders so we don't trash our microbiome and reabsorb from the gut. That three-part system is what I teach. But we end up in a brain phase. Phase number one is we have to prepare the cell and all the downstream detox pathways for detox. That takes a month or two. And then we go into a body phase where the goal is just to clear the body of that, all of these toxins that have accumulated. And then we go deep into the brain and all these neurotoxins that have accumulated over time from birth, from the womb to the tomb. And then we start using those fat soluble chelators in that same system. That system is what I've taught, and I'm simplifying it. But that system is what I hope many, many people get certified in, even the average person.
And how long does it take to go through that process?
I'm
sure it depends on toxicity levels, but in a general sense.
Yeah, I mean, my program that, like, if someone's very sick and says, like, I can't even learn, my Pompa program, as it's called, you work with one of my coaches or doctors that I've trained in that program. If you go to pompaprogram.com, you can actually go into that program. But it's a 5-month program, and our goal is it's different for everyone. What chelators work for you is probably different than me. The dose is different for you than me, et cetera, et cetera. What support you need is different than me. So you work with a coach and you customize that, and then it graduates you to continue that process on your own.
And as you're going through the healing and removing this stuff, does it get worse before it gets better, or do you generally find people's symptoms decrease right from the beginning?
It's different for everyone. Some of your most toxic people start cycling and they go, oh my God, I can think again, right? It's like, it's an absolute game changer. Some people, you have to lower the dose, open up more pathways, and it's a slower process, right? So, it's this, the stock market doesn't just shoot up. It's like this. And that's typically how it is for people. But when you do it right, it's safe and it's effective. And you're not going to get mercury out of the brain by just taking cilantro and sitting in sauna. It's not so simple.
All right, Dr. Pompa, I really enjoyed the conversation. We're going to link up your program, your book, social media, everything in the show notes. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, great interview, Jess. You're amazing. Thank you.
Now that you're done, you're gonna wanna stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't wanna miss it. I'll see you over there.
Dark Calories really tells the story of the biggest scandal ever perpetrated on the American public by a medical organization. And this scandal has affected every American because it's changed how medicine is